Hello everyone, this is week 5 lecture. Today we will talk about reinforcement. When a type of behavior is followed by reinforcement, there will be an increased future frequency of that type of behavior. So that's your general understanding of reinforcement, right? Here's the objective for today's lecture. Positive reinforcement has occurred when a response is followed immediately by the presentation of a stimulus, and as a result, similar responses occur more frequently in the near future. The stimulus presented as a consequence and responsible for the subsequent increase in responding is called a positive reinforcer or a reinforcer. Now we are seeing a figure. The R is responses or behavior, as R plus is stimulus change or consequence. So a response R is followed closely in time by a stimulus change SR plus that results in an increased frequency of similar responses in the near future. So here's the example. So the behavior response is turning head and looking left, and the stimulus change is seeing colorful bird. If the person really likes to see the colorful bird and the consequence serves as a reinforcer, then the person is more likely to do the same behavior or similar behavior in the near future, right? To see the bird. Now, let's talk about SD, a discriminative stimulus. So, SD, discriminative stimulus, is an antecedent stimulus correlated with the availability of reinforcement for a particular response class. Responding in the presence of the SD produces reinforcement. So when we consider SD in this situation, in this two-term contingency, R and SR plus, the two-term contingency for reinforcement is transformed to the three-term contingency SD, R, and SR plus. So a response R emitted in the presence of SD is followed closely in time by a stimulus change, SR plus, and results in an increased frequency of similar responses in the near future when SD is present, right? The explanation is way too hard, but let's take a look at this example. So assuming that seeing a colorful bird is recently reinforcing and a person has a history of seeing birds more often when looking toward chirping sounds, turning one's head and looking to the left will occur at a higher frequency when the chirping sounds is heard, right? We have to consider the immediacy of reinforcement. It's very, very important that consequence is delivered immediately following the target responses. So the person can understand the contingency between R and SR plus. Now let's talk about different types of reinforcers. There are two types of reinforcers by origin. So we will consider if a reinforcer is established or found by learning. So the first type is unconditioned reinforcers. So food, water, oxygen, those type of reinforcers are unlearned. So we need them to survive. So these are unconditioned reinforcers. Conditioned reinforcers, also known as secondary or learned reinforcers, like yellow paper, stickers, tokens, those were neutral stimuli, but they begin to function as reinforcers as a result of being paired with other reinforcers, right? Next week, we will talk about how to select the strongest reinforcer for your own students using different type of preference assessment. Your textbook now talks about 12 guidelines for using reinforcement effectively. So please take a look at those sections. One of the guidelines is about using schedules of reinforcement. So next week we are going to talk about schedules of reinforcement. Now let's talk about negative reinforcement. We say when responding increases as a result of stimulus termination, learning has occurred through negative reinforcement. A negative reinforcement contingency is one in which the occurrence of a response produces a removal, termination, reduction, or postponement of a stimulus, which leads to an increase in the future occurrence of that responses. Now it's time to talk about motivating operations to better explain about negative reinforcement. From the chapter about positive reinforcement, we have learned that for a stimulus change SR plus to work as reinforcement at any given time, the student must already want it, which means reinforcement depends on motivation. Although reinforcement is commonly thought of as a way of motivating people, and it can be, the momentary effectiveness of any stimulus change SR plus as reinforcement depends on an existing level of motivation with respect to the stimulus change in question. Motivating operations are environmental variable and they alter the current value of stimulus changes as reinforcement. Motivating operations have two forms. The first one is EO, an MO, motivating operation that increases the current effectiveness of a reinforcer is called EO, establishing operation. So example is food deprivation makes food more effective as a reinforcer. When you're hungry, you really want to have food, right? The second type form is AO. So an MO that decreases the current effectiveness of a reinforcer is abolishing operation AO. So when you are full, you don't want to have food anymore, right? So a full description of negative reinforcement requires specification of its four-term contingency as you see in this figure. The first one, EO, establishing operation for behavior maintained by negative reinforcement is on antecedent events in whose presence escape termination of the event is reinforcing. And SD, the discriminative stimulus is another antecedent event in whose presence a response is more likely to be reinforced. And R, the response is the act that produces reinforcement. And SR minus, the reinforcer is the termination of the event that served as the EO. So as you see in this figure and the example, when EO is presented and when EO is loud noise from construction outside, and when SD is presented, so in this example, roommate is nearby, R can be asking the roommate to close window. Then the consequence may be no more noises, right? So the reinforcer is the termination of those events that served as the eel. Well, positive and negative reinforcement have a similar effect on behavior in that both produce an increase in responding. However, they differ with respect to the type of stimulus change that follow behavior. Positive reinforcement produces a stimulus that was absent prior to responding, whereas negative reinforcement terminates a stimulus that was present prior to responding. Here's an example. Let's take a look at the positive reinforcement contingency first. Let's say a child did not have food for last 2 hours. Then teacher said snack time and she puts apples on table. If a child say apple please, then the child will be able to receive the apple. Let's take a look at negative reinforcement contingency. Let's say there is a math worksheet with 20 problems put on student's desk. And teachers say complete 5 problems, then you don't have to do the rest. If the student completes 5 problems, then the remaining problems on worksheet will be removed and the child does not have to be involved in those worksheet anymore. So the stimulus will be terminated, right? So these consequences are different, but there is a similarity between positive and negative reinforcement. There is increased effect on frequency of similar responses under similar conditions in the future. So these are the differences and similarity. Negative reinforcement is not punishment. They are not equal. But in real life, we get confused because we are using the wrong definition of reinforcement. People think that reinforcement is the reward, but it's not, right? So, the definition of reinforcement is not provide something like reward, but the real definition of reinforcement is to increase the frequency of a desired behavior. So when we say negative reinforcement, it means we remove unpleasant stimulus. So we want to increase the frequency of the desired behavior. However, when we say punishment, it means we want to decrease the frequency of undesired behavior. Now, I want to briefly talk about how to access Autism Internet modules. Autism Internet modules are very, very good tools you can use for your students with disability, not only for students with autism, but also for students with other disability as well, because the module they provide are developed based on applied behavior analysis, and all of those modules are evidence-based interventions for individual with disability. Although this module webpage is developed for specifically for individual with autism, but you can also use this useful information for your other students as well. So if you go to the webpage, if you click the link I provide, then you will see this page. You can sign up for free. Once you sign up and log in, you will see this page. Click the dashboard function in the very left navigation bar and you will see this page. So the first one you are seeing is recognizing autism, right? The next one is infant and toddler with autism. At the very bottom, you are going to see browse alphabetically. Click that function, the browse alphabetically. You will see this kind of display by clicking browse alphabetically, right? So you're seeing the module list, and for today you will finish reinforcement, so click the reinforcement. If you click that module, the reinforcement, then in the very left navigation bar, you will see several different functions under the table of contents. So you will study from introduction to the very end, the post-assessment. And after you study this module, if you take the post-assessment, you will be able to get a PDF with your answers. Save that PDF and you will upload the PDF with your answers to Blackboard. That's the thing, that's a task you need to complete for this activity. Now let's talk about your practicum report step 3 and 4.